Well, so let us welcome Alex to the CSL seminar. So Alex was first an undergraduate at Caltech, right? And he was working with Christopher Koch, who's a paper which I remember from him called Neural Correlates of Consciousness, which kind of inspired my interest in neuroscience a long time back. From then, Alex moved to Berkeley, where he did his PhD and postdoc with Jack Gallant. And since then, he has joined UT Austin. And Alex has been doing some very interesting and creative work on the intersection of language models and understanding how brain processes language. And today, we are here to hear about all the exciting stuff that Alex has been up to. So, before I hand over the floor to Alex, I would appeal to the audience that if you have your videos on, if you can, that would be great. It always helps the speaker to not speak to a blank room. So if you can, please switch on your videos. And with that, Alex, take it away.
Thanks so much, Pulkit. Thanks so much for inviting me to talk here. It's exciting, it's fun, and it's been a long time since I've seen Pulkit. He was, we were grad students at Berkeley at the same time, and he worked in Jack Gallant's lab a bit, being one of the first people, I think, to really use like features from deep neural network vision models to model brain data when that was still like a very new thing. So yeah, hey everyone, I'm excited to be here. I'm going to be talking today about this work, this kind of line of work, mapping timescales of cortical language processing using mostly neural network models. If you have questions while I'm talking, please just like raise your hand and I'll try to get to you. I'm happy to take questions as we go. So before I start with the actual science, I want to mention a little bit of the people who are involved in this. This work was really carried out by these folks and not me, of course. So in my lab at UT, my students Shivangi Mato and Shaylee Jain and my RA Amanda LaBelle did a lot of this work, collected the data, etc. Shivangi has since graduated and is now working at Apple, and Amanda left her RA position and is now a PhD student at Berkeley. And the work that I'm going to be talking about today was done in really close collaboration with the Brain-Inspired Computing Lab at Intel, who I've been working with for a few years. And my collaborators there who've been really heavily involved in this work are Vi Vo, Nicole Beckage, and Javier Tarek. So yeah, I just want to point out these folks. Okay. So the question or the kind of impetus for this work, I'm going to frame it like this. So understanding language requires remembering things at many different timescales. Right, so if we have a passage like this one, this is a simple little bit of text. We drove to the pizza shop to pick up our order. Then I dropped Wendy and the food off at the park. She would greet the guests there and make sure they were fed while I fetched the other supplies. Planning this party drove me nearly crazy, but it was worth it. So in order to just understand this simple 3-sentence passage, we need to do some inference over long timescales, right? So integrating over this whole passage, we can get this gist that this is about someone having a party at a park, right? That's kind of the topic of this utterance, of this paragraph. At shorter or medium timescales, we need to remember things in order to make certain inferences. So like, for example, co-reference. So when we say the food, we know that means pizza here because we just mentioned pizza earlier in the same sentence. Or when we just say a pronoun like she, then we need to sort of infer that is this person Wendy, and that's again over this sort of medium time scale. And we also need to do things at very short time scales. So, for example, this word drove appears in 2 different contexts, and here is used in 2 different senses, right? Either it drove me crazy, or we literally like drove in a car. So in order to do all these different inferences that we need to do in order to understand language, we need to be able to remember things at these different scales. And this is kind of a lens that we're going to use to attack this problem a little bit. Of course, this doesn't explain everything about language processing, but I think it's an interesting angle. So here's some questions that I'm going to try to address today. I'm going to talk about some work from my lab that has looked at these various things. So one question is, how much of each timescale is needed to understand language? How much short stuff versus medium stuff versus long stuff do we actually need to remember? Second, how can we build a computational model that explicitly captures these timescales, that explicitly captures this information at these different timescales? And third, do different brain areas handle different timescales of information, or can we use the models that we fit here to sort of differentiate between how different brain areas process this information? So I'm going to walk through all these things in order. Let's start with this first one of how much of each timescale do we need? So, there's been a lot of work on language models in the past few years. This has been one of the most sort of dynamic areas in certainly NLP, if not machine learning at large, that sort of endeavors to ask how the past information can be used to predict future information in language. But there's also been a lot of more theoretical work centered on just understanding how much information there is about certain words from other words in texts. So one basic result that is, I think, quite fundamental here is this one from actually physicist Max Tegmark and his student Lin, who showed that the mutual information between words in natural language. So if you look at the mutual information between two words as a function of their separation, so like how many words are between them, it tends to decay as a power law with the separation, right? And this goes into part of this sort of physics tradition of finding power laws in lots of things, but it ends up, I think, being quite important here. So to illustrate, on the left here, I'm showing mutual information in some not quantified scale-free way on the y-axis, and the separation between two tokens on the x-axis. And I'm plotting here just a power law decay, which is more or less what they found in this study, where again the amount of mutual information is dropping as a power law. So this is suggesting that you certainly need to remember less information from 50 words ago to understand the current word than you do from 10 words ago, for example, or 2 words ago. Now, the visualization that I'm going to use for this, actually, we're going to go from this linear space to log space, where power laws are nice straight lines. So this is just replotting the same sort of thing, but with log mutual information on the y-axis and this log separation on the x-axis. So again, this is just showing a power law. Okay, so we know this is kind of a basic thing about the structure of language, but the recurrent sort of memory mechanisms that we have to work with in a lot of machine learning in language, in these mechanisms, memory actually tends to decay exponentially. There's an extremely nice analysis of this for recurrent mechanisms in this paper by Talek and Olivier from 2018. I think this is an ICML paper. This is one of my favorite papers of the last 5 years. It's just a really nice theoretical treatment of LSTMs in particular, and I'll mention it a couple times as we go. So, so exponential decay means that there's some constant kind of rate of decay, right? That at each time point, you reduce the amount of stuff that you have stored in memory by some sort of fixed fraction. Now, exponential decay, if you plot it on the same log scale, it looks like this. So it has a very different shape from power law decay. And there's no way that you can just tweak the parameters of these things to make them the same, right? So there's no way that you can just set some constants on the exponential decay or set how long the exponential decay should be to make it look like power law decay. That just fundamentally can't work, especially for long time scales, where at long time scales, as you go out to longer and longer separations, the power law, so the actual amount of information that these things far in the past have about things now, will wildly outstrip the amount of information that would be available if you're just decaying your memory exponentially. Um, I want to mention here, so I'm talking specifically about like recurrent memory mechanisms. A lot of sort of modern NLP has been centered on non-recurrent, like memory in transformer networks. I think this is different enough, and like I think even calling it a memory mechanism is kind of flawed in some ways, because transformers actually have access to essentially the entire input for every time point that they're predicting. So I consider that kind of a separate thing here. If you have questions or qualms about the fact that I'm focusing on LTMs here, I'm happy to address.
Are we doing questions?
Yeah, please.
Yes. Hi. So when you actually train these like recurrent models in practice, do you know if this exponential decay is borne out in practice? Like when you train them on real data?
You mean if we look at like the behavior of the model as a whole? No, it's not. Right. So if you look at the behavior of like an LSTM language model as a whole, it looks a lot more like this power law. Right. And I'm about to tell you why.
Okay, great.
So the point here of this Telek and Olivier paper, this analysis, is essentially that each unit in an LSTM, in a recurrent neural network, has essentially exponential memory. But by combining many different units, you can actually approximate this power law. So this is something that we found in our work, that we sort of derived theoretically here in this work with Shivangi. This is an iClear paper from earlier this year. We found that we can approximate a power law by using a very specific mixture of exponential timescales, right? So you can look at the paper to find the actual derivation of this, but the core finding is that if you want to approximate a power law in the total decay, then what you want is a specific distribution of timescales that follows this inverse gamma distribution. So you want the timescales, which is like the time constants, the decay constants of each of these exponentially decaying units that form part of this representation. We want those to actually follow this inverse gamma distribution. And if you do that, then you end up with something that approximates a power law. And it turns out that the models already kind of learned to do this. And I'll get back to that in a moment. But so what does this mean? It means that this is kind of telling us, it's answering exactly this question that I posed here of how much of each timescale do we actually need in order to maybe understand language in some sense. So we need a lot of short timescale memory, right? A lot right at this like very short timescale. Some medium timescale memory, and a little bit of very, very long timescale memory. So this has a heavy tail on the high end here. And here I'm just showing this as sort of, we can take these different exponential curves, even though they don't have none of the single exponential curves has the same shape as this power law. If we add all these curves together, or if we average them together, then we can get something that approximates a power law very closely. So this was our finding in this paper, that you can approximate a power law using this mixture of timescales. Now, back to Yoon's question, do like the LSTM language models actually do this? Yes, they absolutely do. It turns out that if you look at the distribution of timescales of the units of one of these networks, like what timescales do they actually learn to hold? It ends up being quite closely matched to this inverse gamma distribution. And further, we found that if you enforce this from the get-go in a way that I'll talk about in a moment, if you design the network with these timescales assigned to each of the units before you even start training it, then that works even better. It's a good prior. It makes the model a little bit better at everything. So I hope that answers your question, Ian. I'm happy to.
Yes, thank you.
Come back to this more. Okay. So, So again, this is kind of answering this basic question of how much of each timescale do we need to just capture the kind of statistical information in language. And it's that we need timescales to kind of follow this inverse gamma distribution. Now, the second question that I raised was, how can we build a computational model that actually kind of captures these timescales, that captures this kind of information? So although I've already kind of given up the game here, what we're going to do is we're going to build this as an extension of a pretty standard tool, which is an LSTM, long short-term memory language model. These are recurrent neural network models that predict the next word in some sequence from its context, right? So it's going to predict this distribution over word t, given words 1 through word t minus 1. And the basic model that we're building this off of is this one from Merity and co. from 2018. This is, I think, kind of become a standard LSTM language model in the field. So this LSTM, of course, we feed in each word in turn. The network takes the information about that word, combines it with previous state information from the last word that the network read, and then it outputs this prediction of what the next word is, or a distribution over what it thinks the next word is. So that's the kind of basic architecture of this language model. One thing that they showed in this Telek and Olivier paper that I mentioned earlier, beyond just analyzing LSTMs as having sort of exponential memory in each unit, they showed this nice theoretical relationship between the timescale of an LSTM unit. So how quickly it forgets information on average in this sort of exponential way, and the bias of the forget gate, which, if you're not super familiar with LSTMs or how they work, this might seem like a detail. This ends up being just like a single parameter in the model for each unit. That's something that we can fix very specifically, and that we can compute the relationship between this thing and a timescale in like units of words. So this ends up being something that we can control, right? We can set this parameter how we want it to set the timescale of each unit in the LSTM. If we want it to be long timescale, then we bias it so that it's very difficult for it to forget information. And if we want it to be a short timescale unit, we bias it so that it forgets almost everything at every time step. Okay, so what are we actually doing here in our model? We are, like I said, just assigning a timescale to each unit. The details are really that we're assigning timescales only to units in like the middle layer of this model. It's a 3-layer neural network, but whatever, that's not an important detail. But we're assigning each of these units a timescale according to this inverse gamma distribution. All right, so we're sort of finding values from that distribution and then assigning those as the timescales of these units. And like I mentioned earlier, this tends to improve LM performance a bit because it's a good prior, so it tells the model something so that it doesn't actually need to learn it from the data. And especially, it improves performance for long timescale information. Essentially, the language model naively has difficulty learning these very long timescale relationships, probably for many reasons. And so adding this prior that there should be some units in the network that capture this that remember things for a very long period of time, that tends to help the model a little bit. Okay. Yeah. I was going to say something else here, and now I'm blanking on it. Oh yeah. Okay. So you might think this seems pretty artificial, right? That we're just injecting this kind of weird structure into this model. How do we know that the model is going to do anything useful with this information? What I'm not showing here, but we do show in this paper, is that actually the model, by doing this, at initialization time, like before we start training these models, the model actually learns to route information appropriately through these units, right? So it learns to route information about short timescale things, or the way that we actually operationalize this is looking at information about high frequency words. So function words, stop words. That information is selectively routed through these short timescale units, while information about low frequency words, so the nouns, the content words, whatever, is selectively routed through the longer timescale units. So just by designating these timescales at the model initialization time, we actually tell the model kind of how to learn this specific structure. And now we also have a handle on this model, right? So we don't just have like a black box neural network that we don't know like what, of course, we don't understand everything that it's computing, but we at least have this one parameter, right? That for each of these units, we have a parameter that says, what is the timescale of this unit? And this is going to be useful for us in trying to use this to understand the brain. All right.
So Alex, maybe a quick question.
Yes.
So you are initializing the biases, right, with a inverse gamma distribution. And are you saying that even initially, without any training, the network is routing frequent and less frequent words well? Or is it something you find post-training that those units?
Yes. Sorry if I didn't say that precisely. It's exactly what you're saying. Yes. So we fix the biases. Initially, the network doesn't know what the hell is going on, but after we train it, it then learns to route information appropriately through these different units. And I want to point out also that we're not actually just initializing the biases, we're actually fixing them. So they're not learnable by the model.
Okay.
Can I ask a question too?
Please.
Hi, I'm Corey. I've been a fan for a while.
Nice to meet you, Corey.
Nice to meet you too. I look forward to reading your paper, but did you compare to an approach where you fix the biases at, say, 0? Like to show that this is about time scale versus just removing degrees of freedom from the model training?
That's a good question. No, so we compared to that, like in our testing, I don't think we actually had that in the paper. It's definitely worse to do that. Like that is absolutely a worse thing for the model to do. Yeah. We actually experimented with like various different schemes for fixing the biases before we did this whole sort of theoretical process of coming up with the inverse gamma distribution that is, I think, kind of theoretically the appropriate thing. And really that ended up being like the best scheme. So I think the theory and the practice worked out here quite nicely.
Cool.
All right. So this is the kind of computational model that we're going to be playing with here. Is again, this language model. It's a recurrent neural network language model where, again, we have these fixed timescales for each of the units in the network. So let's use this. Let's use this to model how the brain actually processes language. So let me tell you how that works, and then I'll tell you about what we find using it. Okay. So the basic kind of experiment that we do in my lab is very simple. We really, honestly, we do like mostly one kind of experiment in my lab, which is just a natural language fMRI experiment. So we have subjects lay in the MRI scanner and just listen to natural language stories with their eyes closed. That's it. It's honestly like the most enjoyable experiment that I've ever been a subject in. It's really fun to just listen to stories. And this means that we can get quite a lot of data per subject. And this data has variation in all the kind of ways that are interesting to us because it's just natural language, right? So it contains these dependencies at many different scales, up to, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes for our longest stories. It contains information about many different topics, people using many different kinds of grammar. Some people speak, very precisely in complete sentences. Most people don't. Most people speak in these, sort of mishmash constructions that are pretty frequently like agrammatical in a formal sense. So there's a lot of interesting variation in this data that we can now try to model using these models. So for the data set that I'm going to talk about today, we're looking at 6 subjects who listened to around about 6 hours of stories from mostly the Moth Radio Hour, also some other sources. I think we had some TED Talks in there and the New York Times Modern Love, which is like another set of stories. They're mostly like personal stories about people's lives. Okay, and so we just have people listen to these stories, and while they're listening to the stories, we're collecting whole brain fMRI data. So multi-band data with a 2-second TR and these fairly standard size voxels. Okay, so this is our data set. It's just natural language. How do we actually go from this to our computational model? So the basic approach that we do is, we have our human fMRI responses here, our language model here. What we're going to do is we're going to take the same stories, the same words that were fed into the humans, right, that the humans heard, and feed those words into the LSTM language model, right? So just simulate how this LSTM language model would respond to these stories. And then we're going to extract the representations from one layer of this model, this middle layer, the one that we fixed the timescales in. And we're going to use those representations as regressors to try to fit the human brain data. So this is, okay, I'll give you the simplified version first and then tell you why this is false. So essentially we're modeling this human fMRI response at time t as some function of as some linear function of the activations of the different units in this language model, right? So we extract this vector of activations that's x0 through xn, where each of these again has an assigned timescale. And then we're learning a linear function that relates this to the brain responses. Now, what I wrote here is strictly incorrect because, of course, the words at time t don't actually influence the fMRI responses at time t. There's actually a much more complicated relationship, and there's a whole world of actually quite a bit of complexity in how you go from these features at each word to predictions of the fMRI responses. This is something that Corey has published quite a few papers on that are, I think, really exciting, cool ways to do this. This paper from my grad student, Shaylee Jane, from NeurIPS last year, was sort of extending our methods in doing this. If you want to see the details of how we actually build kind of the spatiotemporal relationships in these models, check out this paper. But yeah, I'm sort of eliding those details here in the interest of just thinking about this as, the responses are some function of the activations of these units. Okay, so we construct these models. We train the models using most of this fMRI data. We're just using regularized regression. Ridge regression is our sort of bread and butter. We've been hard pressed to find things that actually work better than that. We do have something, but it's harder to interpret, so we're not going to talk about that yet. And then, of course, we can test these models, right? So we train them on part of our data set, and then we can use the same models to predict responses in another part of the data set, and then measure the correlation between the predicted and actual responses, and use that correlation as a measure of how well these language model representations actually match recapitulate the computations or representations that are happening in the human brain. I'll show you that in a moment. But just the point here is that we do get some objective measures of how well these models actually fit the brain data from testing them out of set. But okay, so first, let's actually talk about how we can use the models that we fit to estimate something that we're interested in, to estimate the time scale of these representations. So these weights that we fit using regression, we know now that, for example, feature 0, x0, corresponds to, what was it? Short time scale. Yeah, so we know that this is a short time scale feature, right? And we know, for example, that this feature, xn, is a very long timescale feature. So by looking at these weights, by examining what the weights are on each of these different features and knowing what the timescales were, because we injected them into the model before we fit it, we can try to get a handle on what the representational timescales are of each area in the brain. So let's talk about how we do that. Here's two examples. These are two different voxels. And what I'm showing here is along the x-axis is the assigned timescale of each unit in our language model, in our representation. It varies from less than a word up to 10,000, 100,000 words, more than 100,000 words in the highest few timescales. And what you can see is that there are fairly big differences between these voxels. So for example, and sorry, on the y-axis here, I'm showing just the absolute value of the weight on that unit for this voxel. So higher values mean, of course, like bigger weights and more of an effect of that unit on the voxel. So this top voxel has most of its weight, most of its mass kind of concentrated in these lower timescales, right? So this voxel might be something that we should consider like a short timescale voxel, whereas this bottom voxel has more of its mass, more of its weights concentrated in these like mid to long timescales at tens to thousands of words. So to quantify this, what we can do is essentially we're just going to take like a center of mass of these values, right? This is actually showing it as squared instead of absolute value. That actually does end up mattering in interesting ways that I'm not going to go into here. But yeah, so we define this timescale estimate, TV, for a voxel as this center of mass computation, where essentially we take the squared weight for the squared value of each of the weights for that voxel, multiply it by the timescale, and divide by the sum of the squared weights. Now, this is going to give us some value between the longest timescale and the shortest timescale. That's kind of the average timescale that this voxel responds to. All right. So of course we can do this for every voxel in the brain, and then we can map out, across the brain, what the timescale is for each voxel. Now, what I'm kind of not showing here is that we did this procedure where we also tested the model on held out data, so we get a prediction performance. And we're using a pretty conservative test here to only show voxels that are significantly predicted by this model. So the gray voxels here are not significantly predicted, but again, it's, I think, quite a conservative test. The colorful voxels are the ones that we can significantly predict using this model. And the color is showing what the kind of average timescale of that voxel is. So the red voxels on average have short timescale. The dark blue voxels on average have long timescale, and the sort of pinkish ones are somewhere in the middle. And what we can see here is that this does, to some extent, sort of recapitulate things that we would expect to happen. So, for example, auditory cortex, this like lower level language area where we think information about phonemes and sort of early word information and sound information is represented. That's all sort of assigned short time scale here, whereas areas like the anterior temporal pole, parts of the precuneus, and parts of especially like medial prefrontal cortex are all assigned very long time scale, and that kind of matches our presuppositions at this point.
Can I ask a really basic question?
Please.
Is there a reason, like, do we need to go through the LSTM weights to do this? Or could we, for example, have just like taken a Fourier transform of each voxel individually and looked at which ones have long time scale, like low frequency components?
That's a great question. So we've done this recently, and I'm kicking myself for like not including that slide now. I have an undergrad who's been working on this, Chadika Obinwa. So what we've been doing there is not just looking at the Fourier transform, because fMRI is mostly noise. fMRI is like 95% noise. So it's hard to infer something from just like the response spectrum. But what we can do is we can look at something called the coherence spectrum. So if we look at multiple repeats of the same story, then we can ask essentially at which frequencies is there shared information across these repeats? Is there like more signal than noise? Or essentially we can compute like a signal noise ratio at each frequency for each voxel, right? when we do this, this does actually replicate a lot of these same effects. So it is actually that, if you look for just this simple sort of coherence measure, these voxels, for example, in medial prefrontal cortex, are definitely like less coherent at high frequencies and more coherent at low frequencies, whereas like the early auditory cortex voxels are very, very, very coherent at high frequencies and less so at low frequencies. So it ends up being a little messy to infer things from all of these spectra. It's not like any of them have a really peaked spectra. In general, everything looks kind of 1/f like, and it just with different, scaling factors or different exponents. But we definitely can do that, and it gives us kind of a similar picture.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. Okay, so this is kind of what we get from, again, just mapping out these timescales that we get through this LSTM. But there are things that we can do using the LSTM that we can't do by just looking at the responses. And that is that we can actually use now our model to simulate responses to new stimuli that we didn't actually record real responses to. So let me tell you a little bit about how that works. So this is one of my favorite studies in all of neuroscience. I think it's just like very cleverly constructed and like beautiful and simple, and I don't know, whatever. I'll stop with the adjectives. This is from Lerner et al. From 2011. What they did was they tried to estimate the sort of representational timescale of different voxels in the language system, specifically for representing language, by doing this scrambling manipulation. So what they did was they took a story and they either just played the whole story through, or they broke it up into paragraphs and scrambled the paragraphs and then played that, or they broke it up into sentences and scrambled the sentences, or into words and scrambled the words, or they just played the whole story backwards. And then the part of it that I like less, but they used this method called intersubject correlation. So essentially they just had different people who listened to the same story, either scrambled the word scale for both of them, for example, and then for the same voxel, and these two people, ostensibly the same voxel, they took the correlation between those voxels' time courses and used that as a measure of like how big the response is or how robust the response is in that condition in that voxel. So what they found is that what they argue for here is this essentially hierarchy of timescales across especially temporal lobe, with most of the rest of the sort of language responsive cortex just being longish timescale. What they found is that, for example, these early auditory areas in the superior temporal lobe and like superior temporal sulcus, these areas respond robustly even in like the backwards condition, because they just respond to the sound, but they really don't respond, or sorry, they respond robustly even down to this backward condition, whereas areas that are a little bit further along or higher up in this hierarchy will be more affected by scrambling at longer and longer scales. So, for example, the green areas here, I think the inference is that they respond robustly to things that are scrambled at like the sentence scale, but not shorter. All right. So this is sort of maybe the I call it the gold standard of what neuroscience has to say about like representational timescales in language until now. So one of the things that we can do using our new models is we can just try to replicate this experiment, but not collecting any new data, right? Not doing any more fMRI, but just taking stimuli, scrambling them, and then simulating responses using our models. So when we do that, it looks like this. So this is work that's now in prep. This is something that we haven't published yet. On the right here, again, I'm showing this figure from the Lerner paper. And on the left, I'm showing what is essentially our computational replication of this study. So we simulated responses in each voxel to stories that were scrambled at different scales. And then we essentially measured like how robust the responses were at these different, with these different like scales of scrambling. Did a similar kind of analysis to what they did in this paper. One big difference between this and this work is that our analysis here is all done within subject, right? So we're no longer correlating between different people's brains to get this measure of like response robustness. We're just looking within one subject's brain based on this computational model that we fit to like a single voxel in their brain, right? So all of this is within subject and like within voxel even. Now what we can see is that like broadly, there's a lot of things that are similar here, right? So the low level word to sentence to paragraph kind of hierarchy that that they found in the temporal lobe across the sort of front to back axis of the temporal lobe, we see something akin to that here. It's not quite as clean when we look at the single subject level, but certainly it is broadly similar. And the general tendency of the more far-flung language responsive areas like the precuneus, the prefrontal cortex, to be longer timescale, especially in the right hemisphere, something that we found, is really matched to what they see in this data. So I think I would say that we've like successfully replicated this learner result just using sort of in silico tests with our models. Now, this result is not without controversy. So I wanted to say for a moment, like what we might be able to say about this controversy here. Sorry, is there another question?
Maybe say your thing first and then I'll ask it. Okay.
So there's a recent paper from Fedorenko's group at MIT with Idam Blank, where they claim that essentially, if you look just at the core language network, if you specifically localize out this core language network, and then look for the effect of these different scrambling manipulations on these core language areas, instead of sort of broadly averaging across anatomically localized data, as was done in the learner study, then they claim that these core language areas, especially in the prefrontal cortex and frontal cortex, they all operate at essentially the same timescales. That there isn't the same real hierarchy where the temporal areas are short timescale and the other areas are long timescale, which is what they kind of see in the learner data. But instead, that all of these core language areas are have the same kind of mix of timescales. So this is something that we can kind of look at in our data and see whether we see the same effect. Yeah, okay. So here's just an example, especially focusing on these frontal areas near. So there's this premotor speech area. We call it SPMV. It's known as various things, and there's this sort of Broca's area adjacent speech area down here. And what we find, and this is showing now, again, the just sort of original timescale maps that we estimated for each voxel. What we find, I think, really is consistent with the Blank and Fedorenko results, right? So we see that these specific prefrontal speech areas are themselves like quite short timescale. They're pretty intermixed with longer timescale representations, right? So we have these blue voxels all around them, and certainly further afield in prefrontal cortex. But I think by doing this sort of within subject analysis, where we can see things at the voxel scale without blurring as you need to do when you look across subjects, I think we find something that's really consistent with what Blank and Fedorenko claim here. So I think this demonstrates to some extent the power of this approach, that we can build these computational models and then use them to do more experiments in silico without actually running new experiments, which has been very useful over the past year and a half. And also that they give us extra resolution, right? So they give us resolution to look at sort of the single voxel scale as opposed to maybe averaging over groups of voxels in order to look across subjects, which I think gives a more true picture of what's going on. All right, so this is again part of this this longer paper that's in prep on this topic. All right, now I've shown you, we talked about how this language model works, and I've talked a bit about how we can use it to model the brain, how the brain responds to language. And the way that I pitched this was kind of that, by injecting this structure into the language model, where we force different units to have specific timescales, this gives us an interpretive handle on the model, right? Again, that instead of being a black box, the model has these parameters that we know a priori that we can use to measure useful things like this. We can also go further, and we can ask whether can we do more to interpret what specific language functions the different units, the different timescales are performing, right? And we can do this. This is harder to do in the brain. This would involve doing a bunch of experiments in the brain, but it's much easier to do computationally in the model. So this is something we've done here. This is really, I think we're kind of building off some results from a paper from Alex Temkin and colleagues from last year. Again, where they broke things up by timescale and then looked very similarly at what the function of these different timescales is. So what we did here is essentially used the features of units at or the activations of these units at different timescales to try to solve different tasks, or to try to solve different classification tasks. So for example, we might try to classify part of speech. We might try to classify named entities, or we might try to classify the topic of a paragraph or of a passage. And what I'm showing here is on the left is the classification performance using using the full model, so using all the units. And then each of these other bars is just doing the classification using units that have that specific range of timescales. I think these ranges were selected so that they're similar numbers of units in each one. So we tried to normalize for that. That's why the ranges here are growing as we go out, because of course the tail has fewer units in total. Right, so this is short timescale units up to long timescale units, and the numbers here are in units of words. So what we found is that if you're trying to classify part of speech, really all of that information is carried by these short timescale units. Right, all of the information about part of speech is carried by units that have timescale less than 10-ish, which is not super surprising. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a sensible presupposition. But this is really showing that now we can not just assign a timescale to these brain areas, but maybe also link that to its function. Similarly, if we try to do named entity recognition, so here short timescale is still very useful, but it tends to actually be the more middle timescale representations that are best for doing this. Whereas if we want to get at something like topic, so what is this passage about, then the short timescale units have very little information, whereas the longest timescale units have all of the information. Right? Yeah, please.
Question. If you did this with the fMRI data, is there just too much noise to actually get any classifier accuracy, any valid accuracy?
Yeah, that's the real challenge, right? So if we actually took the voxel data and tried to do these things, the accuracy is extremely low in all cases. Decoding from the fMRI data, especially to things at the word scale, right, is very difficult. Part of this comes from just the amount of noise in the fMRI data. Part of it also comes from the kind of temporal averaging that's involved in fMRI, right? So fMRI is not measuring neural activity; it's measuring blood oxygenation. Blood oxygenation is this like very low pass function of neural activity. So we really have almost no information at the scale of, or it's very difficult to decode information at the scale of individual words from fMRI. Yeah, so that's a challenge, but that doesn't mean it's impossible, and it is something that we're looking at. I'll talk a little more about that in a moment. Okay, so
give me one more question.
Yeah, sorry, please.
So in this particular model, you injected this bias by initializing the biases in a particular way. Mm-hmm. But what if you didn't do that, but if you just look at the biases post hoc in a normal LSTM model, and then, so do they also correspond to different timescales, and could you have used those models?
Yeah. So so that's something that we show in Shivangi's iClear paper. If you do that, actually the distribution of timescales, the distribution of biases actually approximately matches the inverse gamma. It's most different for the long timescales. So the LSTM has a hard time, or the training procedure for this model has a hard time like pushing these very long timescale representations, like getting them to do something meaningful. So that's why we found that like, and so you can do this, right? You can measure the biases, you can measure the timescales post hoc, and then use that to do things with the model. We did find that like enforcing them ahead of time, it improves model performance a little bit. So that's why we stuck with the version that has them enforced. It's also easier because you just know what they are ahead of time.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
So the use of forget gate biases as a direct proxy for timescale, I think is, well, okay. So regardless of whether or not you fix it or do it post hoc, there are ways to construct the cell proposal such that you can overcome that. So although I think it's a reasonable approximation, it's still ultimately an empirical question what the timescales of these units are. I think this comes out maybe a little bit in some of these classification results where even the very long timescale units seem like they're probably much better than chance at predicting part of speech, for example. So that the information is, I mean, I see the asymmetries, but the information is also still quite diffuse.
Yeah.
And probably kind of like stimulus specific. So the long scale units may not need to be engaged in like working memory for long dependencies if those dependencies aren't being required by a particular stimulus. And that's probably the way the human processor works too. So I guess like how much do your analyses, I know it's hard to do, but I mean, you can do different kinds of like input perturbations to find out empirically whether what the empirical timescale of these units are. Have you tried to do that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. That was really where we started doing a lot of that on the LSTM side, and only some of it ended up in that paper. But yeah, we did a lot of analyses of like, if we do specific perturbations. So if we like ablate a word, how big an effect does that have on the states of this unit, as a function of like distance from that word. So it broadly matches. Like overall, it's like highly correlated with like the just forget gate bias. It ends up that that's just a parameter that everything else kind of centers around in a way in the LSTM. Like if everything else is close to zero, then that tends to dominate things. It is like, of course not perfect. And there are many ways of measuring this. They're all correlated, but you're right. Of course, you can construct the network to do things that are a bit different. Like you can, certainly, force units to remember things or to have like recurrent loops to remember things, whatever, over long time scales without actually having long time scale within any individual unit. But the tendency of the model is really to prefer using the forget gate to control its timescale. I don't know how much of that is, inherent to the problem, inherent to the structure of the model, inherent to the priors that we impose, both implicitly and explicitly through the gradient descent procedure, and the various like regularizations that are there. It's a big ecosystem of things, but at least we can measure these things, and we know that like the forget gate bias is a good handle on the general timescale.
Can I ask you a quick follow-up?
Sure.
So it seems like one way in which information can bleed across timescales would be through the lateral connections. Have you tried cutting those so that units are forced to respect the prior imposed by the forget gate more strongly?
So we haven't really, no. I mean, that really limits the computational capacity of the model. Yeah, we talked about that a lot early on, and then that was just like a bridge too complex for us to deal with here. But I do think that like priors that take the form of like that this recurrent matrix has certain limitations on which units can talk to each other. I think that's insanely exciting, and one of the most I think maybe future fruitful directions in sort of using RNNs to model brain data. So I think that's really cool. All right. Yikes, we are almost out of time here, so it's good that I'm hitting these conclusions. So just to wrap up, I want to summarize what I talked about across this set of papers. So first, I showed that the distribution of timescales that are sort of useful for language processing should roughly follow this inverse gamma distribution. That's what we found in this iClear paper. We built this RNN LSTM language model with inverse gamma timescales, and it predicts fMRI data well. I didn't show you anything to compare that to here, but it works quite well. We can use this model to directly estimate the timescale in each voxel, and we can also use it to replicate these other experiments or perform other experiments in silico, as well as do some interpretation to actually ask like what types of information about language are represented in these different units. So this is this series of papers that I'm pretty excited about coming out of the lab. Super briefly, I just want to talk about like what are the future things that we're dealing with here beyond what I've just talked about. One direction that I really believe is going to be a way to go, although we haven't hit there yet, is asking, can we build neural network language models that actually learn directly from the brain? Right. So if we have an end-to-end model that predicts the brain data, can we back propagate from the brain data to the model to actually learn to do things the way the brain does directly? This is something that's going to take a lot of data, but this is something that I'm really excited to work on with Leila Wahebi at CMU. A second thing is, what can we learn about the selectivity, like the language selectivity of each brain area using these LM-based encoding models? This is work by Shaylee Jane that we're really excited about. Stay tuned for this. And thirdly, and this is absurdly exciting, can we invert these encoding models to decode language from fMRI? And I know I said a moment ago that it's really hard to get word level information, but my grad student, Jerry Tang, has actually shown that this is possible to a much greater extent than I would have expected a while ago. We can actually decode quite well. So stay tuned for this one as well. And I just want to close again by thanking the people who are involved in this, especially Shaylee, Shivangi, and Amanda, and our collaborators, V, Nicole, and Javier. And thank all of you for listening. I'm happy to take questions. I realize it's quite late.
Now let's thank Alex for the great talk. And we have a couple of minutes for questions. And there's also a sign-up sheet for people who want to meet Alex one-on-one. So it should be in the email announcement. If you don't find it, you can ping on the chat and we can point you to the sign-up sheet. But before that, if there are any questions.
So I have one very sort of high-level question, which is what I guess really, especially the stuff in the first half of the talk, teaches us about like language in general. And I'm thinking specifically, there was this sort of funny paper from Michael Ramskar that came out like 2 years ago that was basically arguing that all these things that are claimed to be power law distributions of like word frequencies in natural language are not actually, that they're sort of underlyingly mixtures of exponential distributions. And there was like a specific study on personal names. And so, yeah, I don't know, I guess just in a high level sense, like, is the moral of the story here that in fact, things that look like power laws are just side effects of some underlying set of dependencies that are all in different ways distributed as exponential distributions, or is there something real about the power law structure and what we're seeing is just models' ability to approximate it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I think the arguments for like why power laws would emerge in like these dependencies across time in language. So yeah, specifically this. I think this is kind of different than the question of like, why power laws emerge in distributions of Zipf's law, word frequencies, name frequencies, whatever. And that relies on this like kind of power law central limit theorem thing, where like the growth rates of different things, if the growth rates are distributed in some way, then you end up with a power law. What they argue, at least in this Lin and Tegmark paper, is that this is a consequence of hierarchical structure. That when you have hierarchical structures, even like random hierarchical structures, that tends to give you these power law like relationships. So I'm somewhat sympathetic to that argument that this is a consequence of hierarchy and that language does have hierarchy, at least to some reasonable approximation. I think a really interesting question is what type of mechanism, what type of like memory mechanism do we actually want to deal with this kind of information, right? So here we did everything with LSTMs that have this kind of fundamentally exponential like memory, and we had to do a lot of work. We had to like shim these things into this weird shape to get them to to learn this power law like structure. I mean, to be fair, yes, the models learn this on their own, but still it's like they have to learn this weird structure in order to fit their exponential memory into this like power law sort of statistical dependency framework. So I think there's a very interesting question that my Intel collaborators have been working on more recently, which is, can you, for example, just design a memory mechanism for a recurrent network that has at its core like power law decay? Like, what does it take? What would the features of that kind of memory mechanism be? And at least when we were last working on this sort of theoretically, I think there are some interesting points there that like, I'm not 100% sure that this is true, but it seems like in order to have like power law decay, you certainly can't rely on these exponential mechanisms of just like shrinking it by some constant factor all the time. It seems like you kind of have to store some information about when that memory came from, right? Which in some ways feels more similar to like positional embeddings in transformers. It's kind of closely related to positional embeddings. I think transformers are a different kind of beast here because again, they don't really have memory per se. They learn dependencies amongst their inputs, but it's not like they have to store things in memory and then recall them later. Transformers can see the entire input at every step, right? They can arbitrarily like look back to find things. So I think transformers can like easily learn to approximate this, but that's because they're kind of cheating. Yeah, so I think this question of like, I do think power laws are real in this sense, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not super wedded to that idea, but I think that points to interesting developments in the direction of like, are there better memory mechanisms that we could use?
Cool. So let's thank our speaker once more. And let's also thank Aviv for organizing this seminar.